The power of adrenaline. That very night, I managed to break my experiences of fear down into episodes that lasted mere minutes or sometimes just a few seconds. Whereas I'd once treated entire 6-month tours as enormous, life-sapping fear bubbles, I'd now reduced them to manageable packets and made my relationship with fear completely rational and functional. I realised that whilst it was surely impossible not to feel fear, it was certainly possible to contain it. It was just a case of working out exactly where the fear was in space and time, then visualising it before making a conscious choice to step into it and finally doing what had to be done. If it was a surprise how effectively this technique enabled me to manage extreme fear, it was an even bigger surprise to find that it had actually made what had sometimes been a horrendous experience almost addictively enjoyable. There was no greater feeling than popping one of those bubbles by going out the other side of it. As soon as I did, I'd experience a surge of adrenaline. I'd use the massive buzz that my adrenaline gave me to propel myself from bubble to bubble. Before long, I was running around like a lunatic looking for the next bubble. Soon, rather than dreading the next moment of danger, I actually began craving it. People often get fear mixed up with its adrenaline-soaked aftermath. It's important to understand that these are two separate states of mind. It's not uncommon for individuals to confuse one with the other and conclude that they've conquered fear. Instead, adrenaline is a tool. It's a temporary high that powers you onto the next bubble and then the next bubble, providing you with the energy and the confidence to keep on going, and giving you the natural high of the reward when you pop each one. As that tour of duty continued, I began to work out more and more about the fear bubble technique. The final critical lesson I learned was that I didn't have to pop every single bubble that I stepped into. Sometimes I'd enter a bubble, feel all those familiar emotions and sensations blasting up through me, then realise I wasn't ready for it. It was too much. When operational conditions allowed, I'd step out of the bubble again, take a moment to compose myself and try again. I realised that it was extremely important not to remain in any fear bubble for too long. If I did, those dreadful emotions and sensations would start to drain me. They'd become overwhelming. Then I'd start overthinking my situation, and the fear would grab me and hold me there, frozen to the spot as all my courage began to weep away. I had to consciously commit to whatever action was necessary to make the bubble pop. If I couldn't do that, I'd step back out of it, take a moment and have another go. Too much still? No problem. Step out of it again. 2 or 3 attempts was usually all it took. Ultimately, no bubble ever proved too difficult for me to burst. Taking the bubble home. The fear bubble technique not only got me through that tour, it prevented the feeling of dread I'd always experienced between operations from ever coming back. Now that I had my fear compartmentalised and rationalised, and I learned to use the natural power of adrenaline to sail me from bubble to bubble, I began to actively look forward to getting out there. My professional life became all about bursting those bubbles. As it did, my performance on the battlefield skyrocketed. I became a better operator than I ever dreamed possible. And then I returned home. By the time I left the Special Forces, the fear bubble technique had become something that I'd do almost subconsciously. It was just how I handled myself and the various challenges that life threw up. I never considered that it would be transferable to other people until one day I received a message from a 16-year-old boy called Lucas who was doing his GCSEs. After the first series of SAS Who Dares Wins was broadcast, it became normal for me to receive hundreds of messages every week. Many of them from young men with various questions about mindset. Often they wanted to join the military or were simply looking for advice on how to cope with certain difficult situations they had coming up. Sadly, I'm only able to respond to a small fraction of these appeals for help. But Lucas sent me a message via social media that I couldn't ignore. I just don't want to be on this planet anymore, he wrote. What's wrong? I replied. I've got my GCSEs coming up. I'm stressing out. I'm better off not being here. I can't deal with it. Where are you? I said. I'm at home. If you're at home, why are you in that bubble of fear? If you want to get up and have a can of Coke and talk to your parents, you can do that. At this place and time, you're in control. You don't need to be in that bubble right now. Don't put that pressure on yourself. Even the day of your exams, when you're on your way to school, you don't need to be in that bubble. Even when you open the classroom door and you sit down with the exam paper in front of you, you don't need to be in that bubble. The moment control gets taken away from you and the clock starts ticking, that's when you need to get into that bubble. Attack question 1 with a bubble. Once you're done with that, come out of it, enjoy the adrenaline, compose yourself, and attack question 2 with a fresh bubble. After I'd laid out my own methods for dealing with fearful situations, he asked me, but why don't I just stay in the bubble for all 50 questions? Because you'll be in it for too long, I explained. What happens if you only know 50% of question 1? All you're going to do is drag that bubble over to question 2, and then it's going to negatively affect your performance on that question. And what if you don't know question 2? The fear will build and build. The negativity will build and build. I guarantee you won't get past question 10 without your mind starting to frazzle and you losing the plot. A couple of weeks later, Lucas got back in touch. He had tried the fear bubble technique and he'd nailed his exam. But it was what he told me afterwards that really got me excited. He said, Ant, I loved going from bubble to bubble. It actually made me enjoy my exam. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I thought, so did I. I used to run around the battlefield looking for the next bubble to get into. Not only that, but Lucas's performance was dramatically improved by his use of the technique. He reported that his time appreciation was much better and that he actually finished his exam 10 minutes early. He came out of his final bubble, looked around and saw that everyone else was still heads down and deep in it. Hearing all this from Lucas was simply incredible. I never dreamt that this little hack that I worked out years previously on a foreign battlefield as a terrified soldier engaging in brutal firefight after brutal firefight could possibly transfer to a GCSE exam hall in Middleton. It was only then that it occurred to me that the technique might have the power to transform other people's lives just as it had transformed my own. Eagle-eyed fans of SAS Who Dares Wins might have seen its powerful effects in a famous scene from Series 2. After my experience with Lucas, I thought I'd see if the technique could help the recruits get through some of the tough challenges that we throw at them. One capable young contestant called Moses Adeyemi confessed that he was scared of heights and water. Unfortunately for Moses, heights and water were pretty much all we had planned for him in that series. One morning, we brought the contestants to a large river into which they had to perform a backwards dive from a high platform that we erected on top of a shipping container. The moment Moses saw what we had in store for him, he began shaking like a leaf. What the producers of the program don't have time to show is that as well as bawling at the contestants and pushing them and punishing them, we also mentor them. When I saw the state that Moses was whipping himself into, I decided to take him off for a couple of minutes and explain the fear bubble technique to him. Why are you shaking now? I asked him. You're not in any danger whatsoever. The bubble is at the end of that platform. It's at a place and a time that is not here and is not now. So fucking calm down. As I was speaking, Moses was so busy shaking that I thought it was all going completely over his head. But when he walked along the platform a few minutes later, he did so with utter confidence, as if he owned the bloody thing. I watched him get to the very edge, turn around and wobble. That's when I knew he'd grasped it. He was in the bubble. The fear was hitting him. You've got this, I told him. He tapped his chest 3 times and muttered something to himself. In that moment, I could see that he'd committed. There was no going back now. And then he dropped. When he was dragged out of the water a couple of minutes later and hauled into the waiting boat, he looked as if he was wired on some sort of illegal drug. "Easy!" he shouted. "Fucking easy!" If I'd asked him to, I'd bet good money that he'd have gladly climbed right back up there and done it all over again. It's because of my experience with Moses that whenever we have contestants on SAS Who Dares Wins who have to do something heady like abseil off a cliff, I take the time to talk the really scared ones through the method. There's no point standing back here shaking, I tell them. You're wasting your resources. If you keep on thinking like this, you won't even get to the edge. Walk up to it, acknowledge the bubble, visualize it, get in it, and then walk back out of it if you have to. Leave the bubble where it belongs. It gets people through almost every single time. And Moses, that man who was afraid of heights and water and was lost and trembling in a world of fear, he ended up being the last man standing, the only one to make it to the very end of that series. When you make yourself aware of these patterns, you start seeing them everywhere. For example, when people do a bungee jump, they're always terrified before they leap, but as soon as the rope takes their weight, they're instantly elated. They want to do another jump and then another jump. What's happening is that they're going into the fear bubble, bursting it, and then hitting an adrenaline buzz. The buzz is then pushing them to want to go into another bubble. When they do go back into that bubble and do another jump, they're still going to experience a horrible gut-wrenching dread just before they leap. But this time, they know that the moment they pierce it, they'll get an instant massive reward. In this way, bungee jumpers are going through exactly the same process as me on the battlefield, Lucas in the exam hall, and Moses in the Ecuadorian rainforest. It becomes enjoyable. It becomes addictive.